The iron gates of Blackwood Manor did not merely close. They sealed with a resonance that suggested the finality of a tomb. The heavy sound travelled through the floorboards of the hired carriage, vibrating against the soles of Lady Elara Vance's sensible leather boots. The carriage had spent hours winding through the fog-drenched hills of Derbyshire, climbing into an isolation that felt increasingly deliberate. The air outside had grown steadily colder, introducing a creeping frost that settled deep within the marrow. She watched the hired horses struggle against the steep, muddy incline, their breath plumbing in the freezing air like smoke from a dying fire. As the wheels ground to a halt against the brittle gravel, Elara felt the weight of the silence. It was a thick, textured thing, smelling of ancient limestone and damp soil. She adjusted the cuffs of her traveling suit, her fingers brushing the worn but meticulously clean sarsenet of her sleeves. The forgiving grey fabric was a small, tactile anchor in a world dissolving into a monochromatic blur. She had spent years learning the precise shape of being unseen, living on the thin edge of penury in her uncle's uncharitable house. There, she had discovered that the most effective shield was absolute utility. While her cousins danced in the warm light of the drawing room, Elara had retreated to the freezing shadows of the attic office. Amidst the smell of dry dust and old tallow, she had mastered the intricate geometry of a double-entry ledger. She remembered the feeling of rough-grained paper beneath her calloused fingertips and the rhythmic pooling of iron gall ink. She had learned to read a family's true state through its expenditures: the dwindling coal fires, the cheapening of flour, the slow rot of roof beams quietly reallocated to gambling debts. This mastery of the material world was her sanctuary. Standing before the looming obsidian facade of Blackwood Manor, she realized her quiet competence was the only weapon she had brought to her marriage. The villagers had watched her passage with a terrible, hushed pity. Their whispers had trailed after the carriage like dry leaves in the wind. No bride survives a night with the Duke, they had warned, crossing themselves as mud splashed the wheels. Yet, as the heavy oak doors of the manor creaked open on stiff hinges, Elara realized the danger here was not written in violence. It was written in a stillness so absolute it could crush a human heart. Martha Finch stood in the foyer, her hands buried deeply in a starched white apron. Her curtsy was more of a clinical observation than a welcome, her eyes darting to the shadows, avoiding Elara's face entirely. She looked as if she were searching for the ghost of the woman who had arrived before her. As Elara stepped over the threshold, her gaze immediately assessed the grand entryway. To her trained eye, the architecture spoke volumes of quietly diverted funds. The flagstones were uneven, the mortar worn to a fine grit. High above, faint water stains on the intricate plasterwork signaled a neglected roof valley destined to rot the supporting joists. The air inside carried the sharp, metallic scent of floor wax and the dead ghost of wood smoke. Martha took the traveling cloak with a trembling hand, her jerky movements betraying a desperate attempt to keep dust at bay in a house slowly crumbling into the earth. "You are early, Lady Elara," Martha murmured, her voice thin as parchment. The velvet sensory dampeners were only just drawn in the master's wing. "We try to keep the echoes down in the afternoon, the Duke. He does not care for the sound of leather heels on the stone." "It is no matter," Elara replied, her voice steady and pitched deliberately low to test the acoustics. "I am quite accustomed to the sounds of a house, breathing in its sleep. Tell me, Martha, is the estate always this quiet?" The maid spoke entirely to the middle distance. "It is the Duke, Lady Elara. He listens. We have learned to walk on the balls of our feet and speak to the walls so the air does not vibrate. The brides before you." They could not learn the exact temperature of this silence. They tried to combat the dark with chatter and the clinking of porcelain tea sets. The house simply swallowed them. Martha led her through long, echoing galleries heavy with the scent of damp wool and old leather. The portraits of previous ancestors stared down, seeming to track the slight vibrations of her footsteps. Stopping at a heavy mahogany door on the second floor, the maid fumbled with a ring of iron keys. When the door swung open, Elara did not find a wedding suite prepared for a new mistress. She found a museum of discarded lives. The room was perfectly preserved, a frozen tableau smelling faintly of dried lavender and undisturbed dust. Elara stepped inside, her analytical mind cataloguing the room's contents. On the vanity sat a blue ribbon, its dense silk edges slightly frayed. The warp threads showed the microscopic wear of being knotted and unknotted repeatedly by anxious hands. Next to it lay silver hairpins, oxidized into a dull grey patina that spoke of a room kept stagnant for 18 months. Resting on a velvet chair was a half-finished embroidery hoop. The thread was a fine 2-ply silk, but it had been pulled too tight in the final stitches. The extreme tension distorting the linen backing was the physical manifestation of sheer panic, a violently trembling hand that had suddenly abandoned its work. It was a testament to the suddenness of departure. Elara opened the heavy mahogany wardrobe, its brass hinges groaning with a dry protest that indicated severe neglect. Inside hung rows of gowns, their lace collars yellowing with age. The scent of stale perfume and trapped air wafted outward. These belongings of the 3 brides who had come before her were kept in a state of suspended animation. Martha stood in the doorway, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches. "They did not die," Martha whispered, barely a vibration against the oak frame. "They were just erased." The Duke's silence is a predator, Lady Elara. One by one they realized they were living in a void. They left their things, their names, and their very breath behind, just to escape the weight of being unheard. Elara ran her hand along the precise dovetail joints of the cabinetry. It was solid work, built to last for centuries, yet the wood felt unnervingly cold beneath her palm. "Value is not always found in what is said, Martha," Elara replied quietly, her eyes fixed on the empty gowns. "Sometimes, the bones of the thing are enough. I did not come here to be heard. I came here to see. She would not be erased by the quiet." The transition to the downstairs corridor was marked by the sudden appearance of Silas Thorne. The estate steward did not walk so much as emerge from the shadows. His black wool frock coat was tailored with severe precision, and he carried a silver-topped cane not for support, but as a barrier to measure the distance between himself and humanity. His greeting was a funeral-like delivery of protocol, his voice a dry rasp like stiff parchment being rubbed together. "Lady Elara," he began, his eyes skimming over her with detached scrutiny. "I trust the accommodations meet your requirements for the evening. The Duke has requested that you dine alone tonight in the morning room. He finds the acoustics of the main gallery intolerable during the transition of the light." Silas moved closer, bringing the faint scent of sealing wax and old paper. Tucked securely under his arm was the Blackwood ledger, its thick spine severely strained by the weight of its secrets. Elara recognized the look of a man who lived exclusively within columns of ink. She noted the indelible iron gall stain on his right middle finger, and the way his eyes never quite settled on her face. He was calculating her cost, assessing whether she would be a liability or a discarded asset. "I understand you have an interest in the management of estates," Silas said, his voice tightening with a flicker of territorial aggression. "But you will find that Blackwood operates on a different set of principles. Our accounts are a private matter, managed with absolute discretion. I would advise you not to trouble your mind with the ledgers. They are as unforgiving as the Duke himself." Elara met his gaze with poised indifference. She knew the exact shape of a man like Silas Thorne. He was the administrator who padded the margins while the house crumbled from within. The rotting roof joists suddenly made perfect mathematical sense. "I have found that numbers are the only things in this world that do not lie, Mr. Thorne," she replied softly. "And as for the silence of Blackwood, I believe I shall find it quite familiar." Silas narrowed his eyes. The silver top of his cane clicked sharply against the limestone floor. He inclined his head in a stiff warning, then turned without another word, his rhythmic footsteps retreating into the shadows. The darkness seemed to wait for him like a subordinate, closing securely around his tailored shoulders. Elara watched him go. Her mind was already beginning to audit the terrified staff, the rotting mortar, and the silent Duke Alaric she had yet to meet. She was not a victim to be discarded in a stagnant room. She was a woman who knew the value of a ruin, and she intended to find the truth hidden within these neglected walls. Her hand slipped into her pocket to trace the familiar weave of her own sarsenet ribbon, a warm, tactile anchor against the encroaching cold. It was time to begin. The transition from the public corridors to the private wing was not merely a change in geography. It was a descent into a sensory vacuum. Martha Finch led the way, her movements becoming increasingly frantic yet soundless, as if she were a moth fluttering against a window pane. As they crossed the threshold of the north gallery, the limestone floors gave way to carpets of such immense thickness that the very concept of a footfall was extinguished. Elara felt the pile of the wool, a dense, unclipped Axminster, swallowing the weight of her boots. The air here was different. It lacked the erratic drafts of the foyer, replaced by a heavy, stagnant warmth that smelled of beeswax, old vellum, and the faint, bitter scent of willow bark tea. There were no ticking clocks. The absence of that rhythmic heartbeat, so common in a great house, made the silence feel like a physical pressure against her eardrums. They stopped before a set of double doors carved from dark, unpolished oak. Martha did not knock. Instead, she leaned her forehead against the wood for a fleeting second, a gesture of silent prayer, before pushing one side open just enough for Elara to slip through. The maid did not follow. She remained in the hallway, a pale ghost of superstition, as the door clicked shut with a muffled thud that suggested the frame was lined with heavy felt. Inside the study was a cavern of charcoal and shadow. The velvet sensory dampeners, floor-to-ceiling drapes of a weave so tight they seemed to absorb the very molecules of light, were pulled tight across every window. Only a single candle burned on a distant desk, its flame steady and untroubled by any stray current of air. In the center of this artificial twilight sat Alaric. He did not rise, he did not turn. He sat in a high-backed chair of smooth, grainless leather, his profile a sharp, aristocratic silhouette against the darkness. Lady Elara Vance, having spent a lifetime auditing the subtle tells of the neglected and the broken, saw a man braced for an impact that never ceased. "You have been told the stories, I presume," Alaric said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, yet it was delivered with a precision that bordered on the clinical. He spoke as if each word were a precious commodity he could ill afford to waste. "The villagers speak of a void that consumes the spirit. They call it a curse. They warned you that no bride survives the night." Elara remained standing, her hands clasped loosely at her waist. She did not move toward him, sensing that the mere vibration of her approach would be an intrusion. She observed the way his fingers, long and tapering, gripped the arms of the chair. The knuckles were white, the skin stretched thin over the bone. "They speak of many things, Duke Alaric," she replied, keeping her tone a steady, melodic alto. "Most of it born from a fear of what they cannot categorize. I have found that people generally prefer a terrifying myth to a mundane truth they do not understand." Alaric turned his head then, the movement agonizingly slow. The candlelight caught the striking clarity of his eyes, a grey so light they appeared almost translucent. He looked at her not with the predatory hunger the rumors suggested, but with a weary, searching intensity. It was the look of a man trying to determine if she were a hallucination or a new source of pain. "The truth is not mundane, Elara," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the floor between them. "The truth is that this house is a cage of my own making, designed to keep the world from shattering my mind. Every sound, every flickering shadow, every erratic movement is a hammer blow against my senses. You have been brought here to be a duchess, but you will find only a vacuum. If you are to stay, you shall endure the custom of the first night's table. We shall dine. Silas, prepare the wedding supper." The transition to the dining room was as muted as a funeral procession. Unlike her previous solitary meals, the table was now set for two, though the distance between the chairs was vast. Silas Thorne stood in the shadows like a sentinel of stone, his eyes tracking Elara with a cold, predatory curiosity. The room was draped in the same heavy charcoal velvet, extinguishing the echoes of the high ceiling. The meal was served with a terrifying, practiced silence. Each dish was placed upon the table with such care that the porcelain made no sound against the thick linen. Elara watched Alaric. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point just above his plate. He did not use the silver often. When he did, his movements were cautious, as if he were handling live coals. The tension in the room was a living thing. A cord stretched to the point of snapping. It happened during the second course. A junior servant, perhaps unnerved by the Duke's unblinking gaze, allowed the silver tip of a ladle to graze the edge of a porcelain tureen. The sound was minor, a sharp, high-pitched clink that would have been ignored in any other household. For Alaric, it was a catastrophe. He flinched violently, his entire body jerking as if he had been struck by a physical lash. His fork dropped from his trembling fingers, hitting the plate with a second, more resonant ring. Alaric let out a low, strangled sound of agony, his hands flying to cover his ears as his eyes squeezed shut. The knuckles of his hands were white, his face contorted in a mask of raw, visceral pain. Silas Thorne did not move to help. He merely watched, a faint, clinical satisfaction touching the corners of his mouth. "Duke Alaric," the steward murmured, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden vacuum of the room. "Perhaps Lady Elara Vance finds our customs too taxing?" Elara did not look at the steward. She kept her eyes on Alaric, noting the specific contours of his suffering. This was the monstrosity the villagers feared. Not a predator's rage, but a man without skin. A soul exposed to a world that was entirely too loud. She waited until the tremors in his shoulders began to subside. She did not reach for him. She knew that any sudden touch would be another hammer blow. "It is not taxing, Mr. Thorne," Elara said softly, her voice a calm, grounding anchor in the vibrating air. "It is merely honest. The world is rarely this quiet, and even more rarely this truthful." Alaric opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, the grey irises clouded with the aftermath of the sensory assault. He looked at Elara, and for a fleeting second, the weary wall of his isolation cracked. He saw that she wasn't looking at him with pity or horror, but with the keen, recognizing eye of a craftsman looking at the bones of a broken thing. "Go to your rooms," Alaric whispered, the command barely more than a breath. "Prepare for the night. If you have the wisdom the villagers lack, you will use this hour to plan your departure. The silence of the master suite is a vacuum that will unmake you." He rose without waiting for a reply, his movements stiff and fragile. Elara curtsied, a slow, controlled gesture that made no sound, and watched him retreat into the shadows. She had seen the truth now. The previous brides hadn't been killed. They had simply been unable to endure the absolute stillness required by a man who was being shattered by the world. After dinner, Elara did not retreat to the museum room of the discarded relics. Instead, she prepared herself with the methodical precision of a soldier. She did not dress in the sheer rustling silks she found in the wardrobe. Instead, she chose a gown of heavy, matte cotton that produced no static and no sound. She removed her jewelry, placing the silver pins on the vanity with the care of a watchmaker. She wanted to be as invisible as the air, as neutral as the stone. Her fingers brushed the sarsenet ribbon in her pocket, a small tactile anchor she intended to use as a bridge. When the hour came, Silas Thorne appeared to escort her to the master suite. He held a shaded lantern that cast a dim amber glow, his face a mask of cold anticipation. He looked as if he were delivering a sacrifice, his silver-topped cane clicking with a rhythmic, taunting frequency against the muffled floors. "The Duke is waiting," Silas whispered, his voice holding a sliver of malice. "I trust you have made your peace with the stillness, Elara. Many have found that the silence here has a way of revealing the cracks in one's soul." "Then it is fortunate, Mr. Thorne, that I have spent a great deal of time mending things from the inside," Elara replied. She watched the way the light from his lantern caught the oxidized edges of the previous bride's belongings as they passed the north gallery. The items looked even more tragic in the half-light, subbles of women who had tried to fill Alaric's silence with their own noise and failed. They reached the doors of the Duke's bedchamber, a threshold that felt like the entrance to another world. Silas pulled the heavy velvet curtains aside, revealing a chamber that was the pinnacle of the Duke's sensory defense. The walls were draped in charcoal damask, and the floor was layered with rugs until the very floorboards seemed to vanish. The bed was a massive, dark structure, its hangings thick and heavy enough to drown out the world. Alaric was already there, standing by the far wall, his back to the room. He was a shadow within shadows. The only light came from a single, low-burning brazier that emitted a dim red glow. The air was cool, almost cold, designed to keep the Duke's skin from the irritation of heat. "Leave us, Thorne," Alaric commanded, his voice barely a vibration. The steward bowed, his eyes lingering on Elara for a second too long, a look of clinical curiosity, before he retreated and pulled the heavy doors shut. The sound of the lock engaging was a dull, padded thud. Elara stood in the center of the room, her breath held in her chest. The silence here was absolute. It was a void so profound that she could hear the rush of her own blood in her ears, a roaring sound that felt unnervingly loud in the stillness. She looked at Alaric. He had not moved. He stood with his eyes closed, his head tilted as if he were listening to the very atoms of the room. "You are still here," he murmured, his voice sounding like a secret. "I am," Elara replied. She stayed where she was, refusing to add to the vibrations of the space. She noticed the way his shoulders were hunched, the tension in his neck, suggesting a man under immense, invisible pressure. A small sound, perhaps a piece of coal shifting in the brazier, cracked through the silence. To Elara, it was nothing. For Alaric, it was a catastrophe. He flinched violently, his hands flying to his temples as a low groan escaped his lips. The sheer, raw agony in that movement stripped away the last of the Duke's aristocratic mask. He was not a monster. He was a man in a state of perpetual, excruciating siege. Elara watched him, her analytical mind suddenly silent. She did not see a duke or a legend. She saw the bones of a suffering soul. She understood then the precise depth of his isolation. It was not that he did not want touch. It was that he was terrified of the chaos that touch brought. She stayed perfectly still, a quiet anchor in his dark, vibrating world, and waited for the storm of his pain to pass. She would not be the noise that broke him. She would be the silence that held him together. The night had only just begun, and the unbearable void was waiting to be mapped by a woman who knew the value of a ruin. She extinguished the last thought of fear and stepped deeper into the shadow. The red glow of the brazier cast long, distorted shadows against the charcoal damask of the primary chamber, creating a landscape of artificial twilight that felt divorced from the passage of time. The air was a heavy, stagnant weight, lacking the vitality of the mist-covered hills outside. It carried the faint, dry scent of old cedar and the metallic tang of the cooling embers. Elara stood by the massive mahogany bed, her fingers tracing the thick weave of the hangings. A dense four-ply silk that felt as heavy as a funeral shroud. Alaric remained a statue of forced composure by the far wall, his back to her, a silhouette defined by the tension in his shoulders. He began to speak, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ripple through the very floorboards, warning her that the silence of this room was not a sanctuary, but a vacuum that would eventually reveal the cracks in her soul. He spoke of the previous brides, claiming they had not fled the house, but had fled the unbearable weight of his own stillness. He tried to sound cruel, a predator warning its prey of the coming darkness, but Elara heard the microscopic tremor beneath the baritone. It was not a threat, it was a desperate, unvoiced plea for her to flee before his own cracks became visible in the unrelenting quiet. She remembered then the exact nature of the warning she had received only an hour before, in the shadowed alcove of the North Gallery. Dr. Julian Sterling had stopped her just as Silas Thorne had been leading her toward the master suite. The physician was a man composed of weary lines and clinical cynicism, his frock coat smelling of iodine, stale tobacco, and the sharp herbal scent of laudanum. Julian had pulled her aside, his hand raw and smelling of carbolic soap, brushing against the sarsenet of her sleeve. He had looked at her with a profound, hushed pity, as if he were already cataloguing the symptoms of her inevitable decline. He spoke of Alaric's condition as a failing mind, a progressive erosion of the mental faculties that the Blackwood line had allegedly carried like a hidden debt. He called it a dementia of the nerves, a tragic descent into a state where the common light of day and the ordinary sounds of a great house became intolerable. Julian had opened his leather medical bag, and for a moment, Elara had looked down at the instruments of his trade, the silver-plated stethoscope, the lancets, the glass vials of willow bark tea, all of them designed to treat a body he clearly did not understand. "It is a slow unmaking, Lady Elara," Julian had whispered, his voice a dry rattle in the hallway. "The Duke is not a monster in the way the villagers imagine, but he is a man whose sanity is being consumed by his own senses. He has built this cage because he can no longer distinguish a footfall from a thunderclap. By dawn, you will understand that his silence is not a choice, but a symptom of a mind that has lost its filter. You cannot mend what is fundamentally broken." Elara had met the doctor's gaze with a steady, analytical calm that seemed to unsettle him. She did not see a failing mind. She saw a system that was functioning at an agonizingly high frequency. "Perhaps, Doctor, it is not that his mind is failing, but that the world is failing to accommodate his precision," she had replied, her voice low and melodic. "You speak of nerves frayed like old rope, but I see a man who is listening for the water, while everyone else is focused on the wheel. Has it occurred to you that his monstrosity is actually a profound sensitivity? He is not descending into madness. He is drowning in the noise of a world that has no silence left for him." Julian had merely sighed, closing his bag with a sharp final click of the brass clasp, and told her that empathy was a dangerous luxury in a house that thrives on erasure. Back in the master suite, the memory of the doctor's cynicism felt like a cold draft against the oppressive heat of the room. Elara watched Alaric, noting the way he held his head, tilted slightly to the left, as if he were monitoring the very molecules of the air for a sign of intrusion. She stayed perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely in the folds of her matte cotton gown. She was learning the language of his stillness, the way his breath caught, whenever a stray floorboard groaned or the wind rattled the heavy oak shutters. He was a man in a state of perpetual excruciating siege, braced for an impact that never ceased. He turned to her then, his grey eyes translucent and bloodshot in the dim red light, and the aristocratic mask he had worn at dinner began to show the first signs of structural failure. "You are a fool to stay." "Elara," he murmured, his voice cracking on the final syllable. "You look at me and see a husband, but I am merely a collection of nerves that have forgotten how to rest." This room is the only place where I am not being shattered by the presence of another human being. Your very breath is a vibration I can feel against my skin. Your heartbeat is a drum that will eventually become unbearable. Then let it be a drum that grounds you, Duke Alaric, she replied, her tone a soft rhythmic anchor in the vibrating air. I have spent my life learning the value of things the world considers worthless. I know how to mend a ruin by respecting its fundamental structure, not by trying to cover the cracks with noise. I did not come here to be your duchess in the way Silas Thorne expects. I came here to be the silence that holds you together. The transition from the uneasy quiet to the impending crisis was signaled not by a sound, but by a sudden visceral shift in the barometric pressure. Elara felt it first in the hollow of her throat, a thickening of the air, a sense of impending weight that suggested that the Derbyshire sky was bruising into a violent indigo. Outside, the summer heat had finally broken, and the first rumbles of a thunderstorm began to roll over the peaks, traveling through the earth before they were heard by the ear. To Elara, it was a distant, familiar weather pattern. To Alaric, it was a seismic assault on his very existence. He flinched before the first rumble reached the manor, his entire body jerking as if he had been struck by an invisible lash. His hands flew to his temples, his fingers digging into the skin with such force that his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The first flash of lightning was a muted flicker through the thick blackout curtains, but in the artificial twilight of the isolated quarters, it was a searing, agonizing scream of light. Alaric let out a low, strangled groan of raw pain, his legs buckling as he collapsed into the high-backed chair. The sound of the thunder followed, a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the layered rugs and into the marrow of his bones. For Alaric, this was not a storm. It was an unshielded explosion of the world's chaos. The mask of the cold, distant Duke shattered completely, leaving only the man broken and vibrating in the dark. He curled into himself, his face contorted in a mask of visceral agony that no amount of aristocratic breeding could conceal. Elara moved then, not with the frantic energy of the previous brides, but with a slow, deliberate precision that made no sound. She did not call out for Martha or the doctor. She knew that more voices would only add to the cacophony of his suffering. She observed the way the storm was unmaking him, the way each subsequent roll of thunder caused his entire frame to shudder with a frequency that bordered on the convulsive. This was the breaking of the mask she had sensed at the wedding table, the moment where the legend of the monster was replaced by the reality of the victim. She stepped closer, her bare feet sinking into the thick wool of the rugs, and for the first time she truly saw the sheer intensity of his isolation. He was a man told he was losing his mind, when in truth, he was merely losing his shield. She reached into her pocket and found the sarsenet ribbon, the simple silk fabric, a familiar tactile anchor against the encroaching chaos of the storm. She did not touch him yet. She waited for the next flash of lightning to pass, counting the seconds until the vibration of the thunder subsided. She understood that she could not stop the storm, but she could provide the grounding force he so desperately lacked. The night was no longer a void to be endured. It was a crisis, to be managed with the same meticulous care she had once applied to a ruined ledger. She watched him, her analytical mind cataloguing the rhythm of his distress, and prepared to offer him the only thing that could survive the vacuum of Blackwood, the steady, unwavering silence of a woman who refused to be erased. The lightning flickered again, a ghostly strobe light against the charcoal damask, and Elara stepped into the heart of his pain, ready to map the darkness that had consumed everyone before her. She extinguished the last thought of the doctor's warning and focused only on the bones of the man before her, knowing that the unbearable night was only just beginning to reveal its true face. Her hand remained poised in the red glow of the brazier, a silenced promise of restoration in a world that had forgotten how to mend. She would not be the noise that broke him. She would be the heartbeat that reminded him he was still alive. The shadows of the suite deepened as the storm reached its peak, the atmosphere within the room tightening like a drumskin, and Elara Vance, the woman who had learned the art of fading into the background, stood as the only witness to the Duke's raw, unshielded truth. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, listening for the water, not the wheel, and waited for the moment to become his anchor. The first night with the Duke was no longer a legend of death, but a manual of survival written in the language of the quiet. She would stay, and she would see him, even if the world continued to look away. The silence was her sanctuary, and she intended to share it with the man drowning in it for far too long. He was not a monster, and she was not a sacrifice. They were merely two ruins finding the strength to stand together in the dark. The door remained locked from the outside, the sound of Silas Thorne's retreating cane a distant, fading memory, as the grand bedchamber became a world unto itself, a cavern of shadow where the truth was finally allowed to breathe. Elara settled into the stillness, her presence a constant, low-frequency hum of resilience that challenged the very foundations of the Blackwood curse. The storm raged on, but within the charcoal damask walls, the silence began to take on a new protective shape. She would be the grounding wire for his lightning, the anchor for his drifting mind, and the heartbeat that silenced the world. She sat on the edge of the chair, her gaze fixed on the trembling man, and waited for the next wave of agony to break so she could begin the slow, meticulous work of mending. The night was long, and the void was deep, but Elara Vance was a woman who knew that the most beautiful things were often built from the ruins of the most terrifying storms. She adjusted the sarsenet ribbon in her hand, a small, silk bridge across the chasm of his isolation, and stayed. The master suite was not merely a room. It was a physical manifestation of a man's desperate defense against a world that had become entirely too loud. As the heavy oak doors remained locked from the outside, the metallic scrape of Silas Thorne, turning the heavy iron key a calculated act of isolation, Elara Vance began to understand the true dimensions of the vacuum she had entered. The air within the chamber was unnervingly still, utterly lacking the erratic, comforting drafts of a normal, breathing household. It felt thick and textured against her skin, holding the faint, dry scent of ancient cedar and the metallic tang of embers cooling in the brass brazier. Every surface, every corner, was painstakingly designed to extinguish vibration. The walls, draped completely in the noise-cancelling fabric, swallowed the dim red glow of the fire. The charcoal damask was so heavy it seemed to absorb the very light, while the overlapping layers of Persian and Anatolian rugs beneath her feet made the very concept of a footfall impossible. To the villagers in the valley below, this was a place of ritual sacrifice, a dark cavern where Duke Alaric Blackwood systematically unmade the souls of his brides. But as Elara stood in the artificial twilight, her highly analytical mind recognized the space for what it truly was, a vault. It was a sensory tomb built by someone who was drowning in the noise of existence. The memory of Dr. Julian Sterling's hushed, hurried voice in the North Gallery, scarcely an hour prior, echoed sharply in her thoughts. "He suffers from a failing mind, Lady Elara," the weary practitioner had warned, his shadow cast long against the wainscoting as he clutched his leather medical bag like a ward against evil. A profound sensory dementia that strips a man of his reason. It is a progressive decay of the nerves that leaves only a violent, hollow shell in its wake. You must not provoke him, for he no longer knows himself. Yet Elara, the woman who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of being unseen in the margins of other people's lives, recognized that Dr. Sterling had misjudged the ailment entirely. She was an accountant of human behavior, accustomed to reading the hidden deficit in a ledger, and she saw clearly that Alaric was not empty. He was overflowing. She watched her new husband, her gaze tracking the minute, rapid tremors in the broad line of his shoulders. He sat rigidly in the high-backed leather chair, his long fingers digging into the smooth, polished grain of the armrests until his knuckles were white, ghostly peaks in the shifting shadows. He looked less like a predator preparing to strike and more like a stone bridge bowing under a weight it was never engineered to carry. Elara realized then, with a pang of profound clarity, why the three brides before her had fled. She had seen their remnants in the preservation room, the discarded bridal relics left behind like artifacts of a sudden, desperate evacuation. A frayed blue ribbon, oxidized silver hairpins, a distorted embroidery hoop, still clutching a piece of torn linen. Those women had tried to fight the oppressive silence of the manor with nervous chatter. They had tried to illuminate his suffocating darkness with the erratic clatter of porcelain teacups, the rustle of stiff taffeta, and the high-pitched, demanding cadence of social flattery. They had been nothing but noise in a house that required absolute stillness. In their terror, they had interpreted his agonizing flinches as a predator's coiled tension, never once realizing that his terrifying rejection of their physical presence was a purely involuntary act of survival. He was a man without skin, completely exposed to the elements of sound and light, and their every frantic, unmeasured movement had been a hammer blow against his fractured soul. Elara consciously adjusted her own weight, grateful that she had chosen a matte cotton gown that made no sound when she moved. As she settled her feet into the rugs, She felt the first true wave of primal fear settle heavily in the hollow of her throat. It was not a fear of Alaric. She had already deduced he posed no physical threat to her, but a fear of the void itself. It was the terrifying realization that if she failed to find the exact cadence of his silence, she too would be erased by the unrelenting, heavy quiet of the sealed room. The transition from the uneasy, waiting stillness to the peak of the crisis was heralded by a heavy, expectant weight in the air that made the very atmosphere of the room tighten like a drumskin. Outside, the jagged Derbyshire peaks were being swallowed by a sky the color of a fresh, dark bruise. The first true roll of thunder traveled through the deep limestone foundation of the manor long before it ever reached the ear. Elara felt the vibration travel upward through the soles of her boots, a deep, rhythmic, localized thumping that signaled the violent onset of the storm. For Elara, it was a familiar change in the barometric pressure, a mundane atmospheric event to be managed and waited out. For Alaric, it was a seismic assault. He flinched violently before the sound even arrived in the room, his head snapping back against the leather chair as a low, strangled groan escaped his tightly pressed lips. The lightning followed almost immediately, a ghostly, blinding strobe light that even the heavy velvet sensory dampeners could not entirely exclude from the chamber. Each brilliant flash was a searing scream against the charcoal damask, piercing the carefully cultivated gloom. Each subsequent, bone-rattling crash of thunder was a physical lash that caused Alaric's entire tall frame to shudder with a jagged frequency that bordered on the convulsive. He collapsed further into himself, his hands flying up to cover his temples as if he could manually suppress the onslaught of fused sensory violence breaching his skull. The aristocratic act mask, the cold, baritone authority and terrifying stillness he had attempted to wield at the wedding dinner, was completely gone, replaced by the raw, visceral vulnerability of a man being systematically unmade by the weather. The thunder did not merely ring in the air, it battered the ancient masonry, shaking the heavy oak doors on their iron hinges and rattling the brass fixtures of the fireplace. With every violent reverberation through the floorboards, Alaric drew a sharp, jagged breath that sounded distinctly like the tearing of fine silk. He was drowning in a turbulent sea of sensory overload, his fragile nervous system completely overwhelmed by the crushing atmospheric pressure and the violent, unpredictable percussion of the storm. Elara moved then. She did not advance with the frantic, clattering energy of a panicked rescuer, but with the slow, meticulous precision she had once used to mend a ruined ledger by a dying candle. She did not call out his name. She knew instinctively that adding the pitch of her voice to the raging storm would be a cruelty he could not possibly survive. Instead, she crossed the vast expanse of the room, her bare feet sinking deep into the dense, sound-absorbing wool of the rugs, and approached the monster the villagers had so urgently warned her about. As she drew near, she saw the cold sweat beading on his pale forehead, the corded tension locking his jaw into a grimace of pure, unadulterated agony. This was the crushing magnitude of his isolation, a victim told repeatedly by men like Dr. Sterling that he was losing his mind when in truth, he was merely losing his shield against a world that flatly refused to whisper. She tightened her hold on the sarsenet ribbon she had been clutching in her pocket, its simple, familiar silk weave acting as a tactile anchor against her palm. She did not touch his bare skin yet. She knew the shock of sudden, unannounced physical contact in the midst of a sensory crisis would be yet another catastrophe. Instead, she used the ribbon as a delicate bridge. She reached out and allowed the soft, soundless weave to brush against the back of his trembling, clenched hand with agonizing slowness. It was a completely counterintuitive gesture, a small, rhythmic, calculated anchor in a world rapidly dissolving into chaos. Alaric jerked violently at the initial sensation, his chest heaving, his eyes snapping open. They were grey, wide, and translucent with pain, but crucially, he did not pull away. He looked at her, his gaze locking onto hers through the blinding flashes of light, and for a fleeting, suspended second, the silence between them was no longer a punishing vacuum, but a shared, contested space. Elara began to speak. Her voice was a low, melodic hum, carefully modulated to stay entirely beneath the unpredictable tumult of the storm. She didn't offer empty comforts or melodramatic assurances of safety. She spoke of the solid, irrefutable bones of the thing. She spoke of the way the manor's foundation was built deep into the bedrock, designed centuries ago to withstand the most brutal pressure. She spoke of the immense thickness of the limestone walls, and of the rhythmic, predictable nature of the rain washing in sheets over the heavy slate roof. She fed his panicked mind the concrete geometry of the room, calmly describing the exact dimensions of the heavy window drapes, translating the terrifying, chaotic noise outside into a simple mathematical equation of stone, wood, and water. "The walls are 3 feet thick," she murmured, keeping her tone a constant, steady conduit to ground the lightning of his nerves. "The storm is striking the exterior, but it cannot move the stone. I am the heartbeat, Alaric. I am the silence that does not judge the noise." She moved a half-step closer, her steady presence a low resonance of resilience that directly challenged the very foundations of the Blackwood curse. She realized in that breathless moment that the only way to save him was to become the physical filter his own body lacked, to drown out the erratic violence of the storm with a rhythm more powerful and far more intimate than the thunder. She took his hand then, her calloused, ink-stained fingers closing firmly and deliberately over his elegant, vibrating ones. The heat radiating from his skin was startling, a feverish, burning intensity that spoke of a nervous system in total catastrophic overload. Slowly, with an unyielding, even pressure that demanded his physical focus, she guided him away from the chair and toward the center of the room, far from the vibrating plaster of the walls. She didn't ask for permission, nor did she hesitate. She acted with the quiet, unquestionable competence of a woman who knew exactly how to restore a ruin. As the storm outside reached its absolute crescendo, a massive, deafening crack of thunder shook the very floorboards of the primary bedroom, threatening to tear the remaining air from his lungs. Alaric finally broke under the pressure. He didn't strike out with the feral ferocity Silas Thorne had so confidently predicted. Instead, he reached for her. His long fingers gripped her arms with a desperate, crushing strength as a fresh, violent wave of lightning turned the dim room into a blinding, terrifying landscape of white bone. The air grew impossibly tight, every molecule vibrating with the sheer, unbridled force of the squall. Elara did not flee. She did not recoil from the terrifying shadows he had warned her about, nor did she flinch from the bruising, desperate grip of his hands on her arms. Instead, she stepped directly into the churning eye of his sensory hurricane, fulfilling the silent promise that had brought her to this dark, fog-drenched estate. She pressed herself fully against him. Her own body became a dense, unyielding grounding force, physically absorbing the violent tremors racking his large frame. She pulled his head down to the curve of her shoulder, completely ignoring the dampness of the cold sweat at his temple. And then, in an act of absolute, defiant empathy, she pressed her ear firmly against his chest. The rhythm of his pulse was a frantic, irregular, terrifying thing, a fragile drum being beaten in a blind panic against the rigid cage of his ribs. Elara closed her eyes tightly against the strobe of the lightning and began to breathe with him. It was a slow, deep, and utterly deliberate count of 4. She expanded her ribs against his, physically forcing her own calm, methodical cadence into the chaotic, fractured landscape of his senses. Outside, the tempest continued to scream against the thick glass, tearing at the slate tiles and demanding entry with every crack of thunder, but Elara held the line in the darkness. She offered him the only thing that could possibly survive the crushing vacuum of Blackwood, the steady, unwavering weight of a woman who flatly refused to yield to the storm, waiting in the shadows for the thunder to finally break. The violent percussion of the storm continued to batter the ancient Derbyshire limestone, but within the charcoal-draped vault of the ducal bedroom, the nature of the silence had begun to undergo a fundamental chemical change. Lady Elara Vance remained anchored against the broad, trembling frame of Duke Alaric Blackwood, her cheek pressed firmly against the fine, damp linen of his shirt. Beneath the fabric she could feel the frantic, staccato rhythm of his heart, a terrified bird beating its wings against the cage of his ribs. It was a pulse born of pure visceral terror, a physical reaction to a world that Alaric perceived not as a sequence of events, but as a relentless, unshielded assault. Elara did not attempt to pull away, nor did she offer the frantic, shrill comforts of the women who had preceded her. Instead, she deepened her hold, her own steady, rhythmic breathing acting as a metronome for his chaos. She counted the seconds between the flashes of lightning, not as a measure of fear, but as a ledger of survival. She focused on the precise weight of their contact. The heat radiating from Alaric was intense, a feverish byproduct of a nervous system locked in a state of permanent, high-frequency agitation. She used the weight of her own body, a solid, unyielding presence, to provide the stabilizing force his senses lacked. With a slow, deliberate movement, She reached up and placed her palm directly over the center of his chest, her calloused, ink-stained fingers spreading across the muscle. She could feel the tremors vibrating through his bone, a hum of agony that felt like the resonance of a struck bell. This was the unshielded intensity of his solitude. It was a heat that burned because it had nowhere to go, trapped within a man who had been taught that his very skin was a liability. Elara pushed against that heat, her touch firm and unhesitating, demanding that he recognize her not as a source of noise, but as a point of absolute, unwavering stability. "Listen to the rhythm, Alaric," she murmured, her voice a low-frequency hum that vibrated directly against his collarbone. "Forget the thunder, it is merely the air moving against the stone. Focus on the count, 1, 2, 3, 4. She began to breathe with a heavy, exaggerated cadence, her ribs expanding against his with the methodical precision of a weaver's loom. She was offering him the sturdy foundation of her own peace, a physical scaffolding upon which he could rest his shattered mind. For a long, breathless interval, he remained as rigid as a funerary monument, his hands still clutching her arms with a strength that would surely leave bruises on the sarsenet softer skin of her biceps. But as the next roll of thunder arrived, a deep, subterranean growl that shook the heavy mahogany bedposts, Alaric did not flinch with his usual jagged violence. Instead, he let out a jagged, broken sound, a sob that had been curdling in the vacuum of his silence for a decade, and he buried his face in the crook of her neck. It was the first surrender of the Blackwood monster, a collapse not into madness, but into the terrifying, restorative reality of human touch. The transition from the peak of the crisis to the ensuing quiet was marked by the slow, rhythmic receding of the rain against the slate roof. As the lightning flashes grew more infrequent, dimming to a ghostly silver pulse behind the dense charcoal drapes, Elara felt the corded tension in Alaric's neck begin to unspool. The frantic drumbeat beneath her palm slowed, moving from a blind panic to a weary, heavy thud. She remained standing with him in the center of the room, her bare feet still buried in the dense pile of the Anatolian rugs, refusing to break the circuit of their connection. She realized then that the previous brides had never stayed long enough to witness the aftermath of the storm. They had seen the Duke in his agony and seen only a predator's rage. They had fled the room while the air was still vibrating, leaving him to drown in the wake of his own collapse. They had sought safety in the museum room of their discarded relics, never understanding that the only true sanctuary in Blackwood was the very thing they feared. The air in the suite began to cool as the embers in the brass brazier turned to grey ash, but the warmth between them remained constant, a shared atmosphere of absolute mutual recognition. Alaric's breathing finally synchronized with hers, a deep, resonant exchange that filled the charcoal-draped space with a new, protective texture. He was no longer a duke or a legend. He was a weary spirit who had finally found the hollow resonance of a silence that did not hurt. His grip on her arms loosened, his fingers trailing downward until they rested against her waist. His touch no longer a desperate clutch but a weary, searching anchor. He was looking at her through the gloom, his translucent grey eyes no longer bloodshot with pain, but clear with a profound, exhausted awe. It was the look of one who had been seen for the first time in his life, witnessed not as a failing mind or a broken aristocrat, but as a living soul worthy of the effort of mending. "It is quiet," he whispered, the word barely a vibration in the heavy air. "It was always quiet, Alaric," Elara replied softly, her hand still resting over his heart. "The world is only as loud as the barriers we build against it. You do not need to fight the noise anymore. I will be the shield that guards the gate. I will be the ledger that accounts for every vibration." She led him toward the massive bed, her movements as fluid and silent as the shadows themselves. She did not ask for permission. She operated with the quiet authority of a woman who had taken command of a ruin and intended to see it restored. The thick, four-ply silk hangings were pulled back, revealing the cool, crisp expanse of the linen sheets. As Alaric sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy weight of his exhaustion finally claimed him. The years of sensory siege, the endless nights of braced, agonizing stillness, and the sheer crushing pressure of the Blackwood myth converged into a single, overwhelming need for rest. He looked at her one last time, a silent question in his gaze, and Elara answered it by sitting beside him, her presence a constant low-frequency hum of safety that promised him he would not be erased by the morning light. The fulfillment of the title came not with a flourish of Regency melodrama, but in the deep, contented quiet of the early morning hours, as the Derbyshire fog began to press its white face against the master suite's windows. Alaric Blackwood, the man the villagers swore no woman could survive a night with, lay back against the pillows, his entire frame finally sinking into the restorative depths of the mattress. He reached out and pulled Elara toward him, not with the predatory intent of the rumors, but with the instinctive, protective need of a husband who had found his only vital anchor. He guided her head to the center of his chest, and as she settled against the broad, steady plane of his ribs, the last of his defenses dissolved into the shadows. He fell into a sleep, so profound it was almost alarming, a deep, dreamless state where the senses were finally allowed to go dark. It was a restorative peace he had not achieved in a decade, a natural resetting of the nerves that could only occur in the presence of a woman who was not afraid of his silence. Elara listened to the heavy, rhythmic drone of his breathing, the sound now a comforting, predictable anchor. She was exhausted herself, her own mind weary from the clinical management of his crisis and the lingering primal fear of the void, but she did not pull away. She remained anchored to him, her ear pressed to his chest, listening to the slow, steady count of his heart. She felt the heavy weight of his arm draped over her shoulders, a protective gesture that was as natural as the turning of the tide. As the light strengthened over the Derbyshire hills, the sound of a heavy brass key grinding against the lock at precisely 7:15 broke the stillness of the hallway. It was a cold, clinical sound, the noise of a man coming to collect a debt he believed was already paid in blood. The heavy oak doors of the private sanctuary creaked open, admitting a sliver of grey, morning light that cut through the gloom of the charcoal damask. Silas Thorne stepped into the room first, his face a mask of practiced, funereal solemnity that poorly concealed a jagged, predatory expectation. He held himself with the rigid confidence of a man who had already mentally balanced the Blackwood ledger in his favor, assuming the Duke's latest episode would leave him either widowed or completely unraveled. Behind him, Dr. Julian Sterling hovered, his medical bag clutched tightly, his eyes darting to the corners of the room as if searching for the remains of the tragedy he had predicted. The two men stopped abruptly, the air in their lungs catching as they reached the edge of the great mahogany bed. There was no violence, there was no shattered glass or blood-stained silk. Instead, they were met by the most terrifying sight Silas Thorne could imagine, the exact temperature of peace. Duke Alaric Blackwood lay in a sleep so deep it looked like a miracle, his features smoothed of the agony that had defined them for years. And anchored to his chest, her simple cotton gown rumpled but her presence unmistakable, was Lady Elara Vance. She was not a victim, she was the living Duchess, her hand still resting protectively over the Duke's heart, the sarsenet ribbon tangled in her fingers like a silken bridge between their souls. Elara opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting Silas's with a clarity that made the steward flinch. She did not move from her place on Alaric's chest, nor did she speak a word of apology for her survival. She simply watched him, her eyes reflecting the dawn, witnessing the exact moment his control over the Blackwood legacy began to crumble. In that silence, the poetic justice was absolute. The woman Silas had dismissed as a penniless inconvenience had become the very cornerstone that would keep the Duke from falling. "The Duke is resting, Mr. Thorne," Elara said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of the house itself, "and he is not to be disturbed. I believe you have some accounts to prepare for my review." Silas Thorne's face went the color of grey ash, his grip on the heavy door handle loosening as the household staff behind him began to whisper in hushed, awestruck tones. The legend of the bride who did not survive had been replaced by the reality of the woman who had mended the ruin. As the light filled the room, Elara finally surrendered to the quiet, her head sinking back onto Alaric's chest. They slept in the ordinary light, finally witnessed and finally safe, while the world prepared to acknowledge the truth of what she had built in the dark. As the dawn breaks over the hills, we wonder, what ruins in your own life are you currently mending? Tell us from which corner of the world you are listening to this story tonight. The morning light did not arrive at Blackwood Manor with a triumphant burst. It filtered through the heavy charcoal grey clouds of the Derbyshire peaks like a slow, deliberate confession. It was a cold, thin illumination that touched the limestone exterior of the house first, highlighting the ancient, moss-slicked seams of the masonry before creeping through the gaps in the master suite's thick oak shutters. Within the chamber, the artificial twilight of the heavy velvet hangings was slowly being unmade. The air, which had been thick with the electric tension of the storm, now carried the heavy, engrounded scent of wet slate and cooling cedar. Lady Elara Vance felt the shift in the atmosphere through the very marrow of her bones. She remained anchored to the broad, steady chest of Duke Alaric Blackwood, her cheek still resting against the fine linen of his shirt, which had dried into a soft, crumpled texture against her skin. The rhythm of his heart, once a frantic and irregular drum, had settled into a deep, resonant drone, the steady pulse of a survivor who had finally found the pure essence of safety. Elara lay in the half-light, her mind performing a quiet audit of the night's events. She remembered the precise weight of the sarsenet ribbon, still tangled in her fingers, and the way the shadows had seemed to retreat, as she offered her own heartbeat as a filter for Alaric's pain. She had spent a lifetime learning the shape of being unseen, but in the profound silence of this bed, she felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of being the only witness to a man's restoration. She watched a single dust mote dance in a sliver of grey light, its erratic movement the only allowed to disrupt the absolute stillness of the room. She was exhausted, a deep, muscular weariness that made her limbs feel like heavy limestone, but she did not move. She knew that the first restorative sleep Alaric had achieved in a decade was a fragile thing, a glass vessel that could be shattered by the slightest tremor of her departure. The intrusion began at precisely 7:15. It was not a violent entrance, but a calculated, clinical violation of the sanctuary. The sound of the heavy brass key, grinding against the lock, carried through the soundproofed walls, a metallic scrape that Elara felt as a vibration through the mattress before she heard it with her ears. She felt Alaric's pulse skip a beat, the subconscious warning of a man whose nerves were still calibrated for siege. Slowly, with the agonizing deliberation of a predator moving through tall grass, the heavy oak doors creaked open. The light from the hallway flooded into the charcoal gloom, a harsh yellow intrusion that smelled of floor wax and the stale medicinal scent of the local physician. Silas Thorne stepped over the threshold first, his black wool frock coat tailored with such severity that he looked like a shard of obsidian against the morning light. He held a silver-topped cane with his right hand, the tip poised to strike the floor and shatter the quiet, but he stopped abruptly. His face, usually a mask of practiced, funereal solemnity, underwent a violent structural collapse. For a fleeting second, the predatory expectation, the look of an opportunist who had come to collect the remains of a bride or the shards of a ruined duke, was replaced by a jagged, naked shock. Behind him, Dr. Julian Sterling hovered, his hand clutching his leather medical bag so tightly the brass clasp rattled. Martha Finch stood in the very back, her hands buried in her apron, her eyes wide and glassy with the superstitious terror of a woman expecting a ghost. The three of them stood at the edge of the great mahogany bed, their presence a cold draft against the warmth Elara had built in the dark. They were met by a sight that defied every legend of the Blackwood curse. Alaric did not look like a monster, and Elara did not look like a sacrifice. They looked like the bones of a house that had finally found its foundation. Alaric lay in a sleep so deep it looked like a miracle, his handsome features smoothed of the white-knuckled tension that had defined his public life. Elara opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Silas Thorne's with a clarity that felt like the stroke of a razor. She did not recoil, nor did she attempt to hide the rumpled state of her cotton gown. She simply remained anchored to her husband, her hand still resting over his heart, asserting her status as the mistress of the vacuum. "The Duke is resting, Mr. Thorne," Elara said, her voice a low, melodic alto that held the room's silence like a precious commodity. "And he is not to be disturbed. I believe the household has been kept in a state of unnecessary alarm for far too long. You may withdraw." Silas Thorne's throat moved in a visible dry swallow, the silver top of his cane trembling slightly against the rug. He looked from the peacefully sleeping Duke to the woman he had dismissed as a penniless, invisible asset, and he realized the exact moment his control over the Blackwood ledger began to dissolve. The poetic justice was absolute. He had sought to use Alaric's vulnerability as a weapon of isolation, only to find that the very woman he had brought in to be erased had become the Duke's only vital bridge to the world. Martha Finch let out a small, strangled sob of relief and crossed herself, her superstitious fear finally unmaking itself in the presence of the ordinary light. Silas tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the authority in the room had shifted. It no longer resided in the heavy velvet or the locked doors. It resided in the heartbeat Elara was guarding. The steward bowed, a stiff, shallow gesture that betrayed the fracturing of his composure, and backed out of the room, followed by the weary doctor and the trembling maid. As the door clicked shut with a muffled, felt-lined thud, the sanctuary was restored. Elara felt Alaric stir against her, his hand moving to cover hers where it still lay over his heart. He did not open his eyes immediately. He simply exhaled a long, deep sound of surrender that signaled the true end of the storm. He pulled her closer, his strength returning in a quiet, protective wave, and for the first time in the history of Blackwood Manor, the dawn did not bring a departure. It brought a beginning. The transition from the intimacy of the bedchamber to the clinical coldness of the estate library was marked by the scent of old parchment and the sharp, acidic tang of fresh iron gall ink. 2 hours had passed since the intrusion, and the morning light had fully established itself, revealing the neglected reality of the manor's interior. Lady Elara Vance sat at the massive oak desk, her fingers moving with rhythmic precision as she opened the Blackwood ledger. The book was a heavy, leather-bound volume, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed with the stagnant air of Silas Thorne's long tenure. Alaric stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the Derbyshire hills. He was still physically sensitive. The velvet sensory dampeners remained partially drawn, but the jagged, convulsive tremors of the previous night had settled into a quiet, watchful stillness. He was watching Elara, his translucent grey eyes tracking the way she held the pen, realizing that her mind was as meticulous and unyielding as the silence she had offered him in the dark. Elara performed the audit with the same dedicated competence she had once used to survive her uncle's house. She did not look for grand betrayals. She looked for the microscopic inconsistencies in the columns of ink. She traced the diverted funds for the roof valley, the annuities paid to non-existent contractors, and the slow, calculated embezzlement of the estate's limestone quarry profits. Silas Thorne stood before the desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his face the color of grey ash. He tried to maintain his mask of administrative necessity, but in the presence of Elara's quiet, mathematical scrutiny, he looked like a moth pinned to a board. "You speak of the Duke's failing mind as a justification for your management, Mr. Thorne," Elara said, her voice steady as she compared the physical decay of the foyer to the inflated repair costs in the ledger. "But I find that the only thing failing in this house is the integrity of its records. You have weaponized the Duke's sensory isolation to build a wall of paper between him and his own heritage. You expected a bride to be a sacrificial noise that would drive him further into the dark, leaving you to manage the ruins in peace." She turned a page, the sound of the paper crisp and final in the quiet library. "However, you underestimated the value of a ruin to someone who knows how to mend. The Blackwood ledger is no longer your private matter. It is an account of a debt you can never repay. You will leave the manor today, Silas. The annuity you carved for yourself is forfeit, and the records of the limestone quarry will be sent to the magistrate by noon." Silas Thorne's composure shattered. He did not shout. He lacked the courage for loud drama. Instead, he simply withered, the silver-topped cane slipping from his fingers to clatter against the floor, a sound that made Alaric flinch, but only for a fleeting second before Elara's gaze anchored him. The steward realized that the worthless girl he had shamed with a cold welcome had outbid him for the soul of the house. He turned and retreated, his rhythmic footsteps no longer taunting, but the desperate sounds of a man being erased by his own hypocrisy. Alaric moved away from the window then, crossing the room to stand behind Elara's chair. He did not touch her immediately. He leaned down and looked at the ledger, his mind finally engaging with the material reality of his estate. He saw the corrections she had made in her neat, precise hand, the ink still wet on the page. He realized that she had not just saved him from a night of agony. She had restored his legacy from the shadows. "The villagers will need a new story to tell," Alaric murmured, his voice a warm baritone that held no trace of the previous night's desperation. "They will have to learn the name of the Duchess who survived the void." "They will learn that the void was never here, Alaric," Elara replied, looking up at him. Only a man who was waiting for someone brave enough to share his silence. "The curse of the dead brides was never a predator's strike. It was a failure of empathy. They looked at your cracks and saw a monster. I looked at the bones and saw a house that needed mending." They walked together toward the North Gallery, stopping before the museum room of the discarded bridal relics. Elara reached out and opened the heavy mahogany doors, allowing the fresh morning air and the scent of damp earth to flood the stagnant chamber. She looked at the blue ribbon, the oxidized hairpins, and the half-finished embroidery. With a symbolic gesture of restoration, she began to gather the items, not to discard them but to give them back to the world. The gowns would be given to the village girls. The silver would be cleaned and used. The silence would be broken not by chatter, but by the healthy sounds of a house that was no longer a cage. She had spent a lifetime mastering the method of absolute invisibility. But, as she stood in the ordinary light, with Alaric's hand finally resting securely on her shoulder, Lady Elara Vance knew that she was finally fully witnessed. The ruins of Blackwood were no longer a tomb, and she was no longer a ghost. She had built a future from the very stones the world had mocked, finding the loudest truths in the quietest ledgers. What ruins in your own life are you currently mending or restoring? We often find our greatest strength in the places the world told us were broken. Tell us from which corner of the world you are listening to this story tonight. Have you ever found a sanctuary where others only saw a storm? Share your thoughts below.